So since this is a session that is focused on physical systems, I feel obliged to start out with a physical network. I'll be over in a couple of slides, so if you're not a physicist, just wait. It's a very simple four-node network that illustrates one of the points that I want to make here today. In this network, you have the particles as nodes, and they are interacting with each other through attractive forces. So the top particle is attracting the middle ones. This middle particle here attracts the top, the middle one, and the other one here, and it's symmetric. So now, if this system is in equilibrium, in a stable equilibrium, the intuition of most people would say that if you increase this tension by increasing F, you try to pull them apart, that the distance H would increase for the excellent reason that all natural materials behave that way. But I tell you that depending on how you set up these interactions, even though they are attractive forces, you can have the opposite response, in which as you increase the tension, this system will actually contract. And here is a mechanism that can give rise to this type of counterintuitive behavior. As you increase the force, the length increases up to a point where that state either becomes unstable or simply disappear. Okay? Once there, the system has no option other than jump into another stable state, which by design is set to be at a shorter length in this case. So why is this interesting? Well, for two reasons. For the purpose of this talk, I want you to keep in mind the fact that this is by and large, a bistable system, and I'm taking advantage of that. In practice, this is relevant to design materials, metamaterials, materials that gain their properties from the structure rather than the chemical composition. I will show you an animation now where the arrows of a piece of this material, where the arrows indicate the size of the force, and you'll see that when it goes from red to green, red to blue actually, you have a transition associated to this destabilization. In the case of the material, this becomes a phase transition, it's a negative compressibility transition. So you see, it's about 5% contraction in this case. You can increase that effect if you want. So this is a form of control. We are controlling the behavior of the system by designing the network so that it will respond in very specific ways to the control parameter that is in this case the force. Yeah, you can generate also waves when the force is non-uniform like now. Okay. Now let's go to an example that's a bit closer to what I want to cover here. A small food web. This is the example of a relevant part of the food web in the Channel Islands in California. Do you have any clue? All right, this should be better now. Okay, so this is an example in which you have a species that was at the time believed to be native to these islands, the island fox, living happy there until an invasive species was introduced, the feral pigs. That was about 150 years ago. Even though those two species do not interact directly with each other, after some years, the population of foxes start to decline. And that happened because eagles were attracted to the island. They were attracted to the island by the pigs. They were feeding mostly on pigs. But occasionally they would eat foxes, and that was enough to bring the population of foxes close to extinction. So this is an interesting example because the primary cause of the problem, the introduction of pigs, cannot be the only solution. If you remove the pigs now, the eagles, which happen to be a protected species, by the way, would eat all the foxes. So this was a problem that was addressed by removing 2 species. It was challenging because one of them has to be removed in a non-lethal way. But it illustrates this idea that perturbations are not reversible in a trivial way in a network. These examples are very carefully chosen to have a very small number of degrees of freedom, a very small number of nodes. But in general, most of the networks that we care about, they are much larger. They are in general dynamical systems. They are made up of nodes that are dynamical systems, and therefore they are dynamical systems which have a very large number of degrees of freedom. One obvious example of that is, of course, the brain. And here we are talking about something on the order of 10 to 11 dynamical units coupled together. Another example that has been widely studied in this community is the case of metabolic networks. Here we are talking about several hundreds to a few thousand coupled biochemical reactions. Power grid networks are in general of the same order in terms of number of degrees of freedom, even when you consider only the generators as the units in the system. In the US, you have 3 main interconnections, East, West, and Texas, and each one of them has at least several hundred sizable power generators, not counting the small ones. One thing that's important about these systems is that they are not only dynamical, they are nonlinear. Take, for example, power grids. The dynamics of the generators is given by this equation, so-called swing equation. Here you have the time variation of the frequency of the generator given by the difference between the mechanical power provided by the generator and the electrical power demanded by the network. And the electrical power depends nonlinearly on the angles of the other generators. In the case of metabolism, even the simplest models, like the one I'm writing down here, are nonlinear. In this case, you have here the concentration of a metabolite given in terms of reaction rates on the right side. S is the stoichiometric matrix, which has information about the structure of the network. But the reaction rates depend nonlinearly on the concentrations of the metabolites. Food webs, even the simplest models, are obviously nonlinear. So what comes with these 2 things, the networks being nonlinear and be large, is that they tend to have a very large number of stable states or attractors. Take, for example, the case of Lotka-Volterra. It has 2 to the power n fixed points, not counting other attractors. Many of those are in the positive part of the state space, and they are stable. The other important thing is that they usually operate in a decentralized way. Even not only natural networks, but even infrastructure and technological networks like the power grid, it is operated in a decentralized way. You don't have a central operator optimizing this system as a whole. So what this leads to is that when you perturb these systems, they will tend to respond in a suboptimal way to perturbations. Here is one example that illustrates this point. It's a system that we have been studying. I'll have to find a way to keep this. Let me try this. So this is the example of a single-cell organism, E. coli. So when you perturb E. coli by knocking out one of its genes, one of 2 things will happen. Either nothing happens because that gene is not relevant for the given conditions, or the growth rate will tend to go down. That's not necessarily a permanent change. It might be temporary. After a few hundred generations, or perhaps a few thousand generations, the organism might have gained mutations to reactivate pathways that were inactive, and the growth rate might go back to a level that was comparable to the original one. But when you look at the metabolic network, at the metabolic network level, you have a burst of reaction activations activation following that decrease in growth rate. This is what we call the activation of latent pathways, because they are inactive both before and after, but over the time of adaptive evolution, they are active. So one hypothesis that has been out there is that these reactions have been activated by the cell in an attempt to cope with the impact of the perturbation. So it's such that they will help the cell to reproduce. So this should therefore have a positive impact in growth rate. But there is another hypothesis, that's our hypothesis. This is a genetic response because the system is decentralized. In the best case scenario, this is just providing a library of possible states for the cell to choose from. So we have tested this in silico, and you see here for a number of primary perturbations. We tested the growth rate after this perturbation for the original organism and for a modified organism in which we have removed upfront all the latent pathways. And in each case, we see that the latent pathways, the removal of latent pathways, in fact, increases growth rate rather than decrease. And that's an interesting thing because this provides a foundation for something that we have discovered a few years ago with a number of collaborators that I'm sure you know, which was that in the case of metabolic networks, very often you have gene knockouts that are lethal, but when combined with certain other gene knockouts, they are no longer lethal. It's counterintuitive because had you done just the other gene knockout, it would also have a negative impact in growth. But something happens when you implement both of them together. And what happens is that the second is somehow compensating for part of the damage introduced by the first one. This is not just a curiosity. There are many experiments being run now to take advantage of this. And one of these experiments I'm involved with is to try to use this to design new types of antibiotics that would be drug resistant. So you create not one antibiotic, but two, so that you can take advantage of the antagonistic interaction between them. Here is a more obvious example of this type of phenomenon. This is an example that you should regard as a toy example. It's a little food in silico food web being modeled using the consumer resource dynamics. In this case here, we have that the network is initially in a stable state, time independent, in which all the species have positive population. But when you remove these species here, two others are driven to extinction. Here is the time evolution of those species population. But that's not the best state available if you take your objective function to be the number of surviving species. In fact, if you knock out this species here, the blue one, soon after the green one, you see that those two that would be extinct, they will now, over roughly the same time scale, will stabilize at positive populations. Okay, so you have one more species surviving in this case. Okay, so what we have here is some evidence that when something does go wrong in a system, because the propagation of failures takes some time, you have some time to take actions. And these actions can actually correct at least part of the damage. Okay, and this leads to the idea of compensatory perturbations. But not all perturbations are admissible. Why? Because even though the time for failures to propagate is finite, it is very short compared to the time for the evolution of the network. So you cannot expect to create new links or introduce new nodes in general. You have really to try to take advantage of the resources that are already available in the system. Okay? The problem with this, so in the examples I gave, is not just that I wanted to give you counterintuitive examples. It's in general much easier to down-express reactions than coordinatedly upregulate them. And in the case of species with the exception of fishes and a few others, it's usually difficult to increase populations over a short time frame. So you have to really consider suppressing and controlling the populations that you have at hand. The problem with this is that essentially all the perturbations that you are allowed to implement, they are deleterious, or at least apparently deleterious. So in this talk, I will try to convince you that this is just a local property. If you consider the system as a whole, they can be beneficial. Okay? A few more examples to train our intuition. In this case here, I have a slightly bigger food web in which the deletion of green leads yellow to extinction. And all the other yellows can be saved by the concurrent deletion of this species here, which is a species that would go extinct anyway. So the timing of the intervention is very important. Okay? That's one thing that you can conclude from here. Of course, these are just toy examples. In practice, you would not think about removing a species. There are other smarter things that you can do. You can consider partial removals, or you could consider the reduction of growth rate in the case of primary producers, or the increase of mortality rate in the case of other species. In these examples here, all the secondary extinctions would be prevented by doing so. All right, so putting together the pieces, the picture that emerges here is the one in which most of the damage is not caused by the primary perturbation, it's actually caused by the propagation of those of its consequences, you can say. And in terms of dynamical systems, what that means is that your system is conversion to a bad state. Okay? We eventually go to a state in which, say, all the species are extinct, or the cell is not able to grow and reproduce. But I want to convince you that this does not mean that you don't have good states available. And in general, it appears that you do have good states available based on the many systems that we have studied over the years. The problem is that the network, for being decentralized, doesn't converge to the good states spontaneously. So the problem of control that I want to discuss here today is the one in which we try to identify an admissible compensatory perturbation that can bring the network to a good state. And we want to be able to do that even when the system is hit by a perturbation that was not predicted. So you have to be able to act after the facts. All this is fun, but at some point you want to be able to interpret the results. So usually we want to go back to a network representation at some point. And here is an example for an aquatic food web in which we try to do modeling as realistically as we could at the time. The sizes of the nodes represent the probability that removing that node and two random others would trigger a cascade of extinctions. And the color indicates the probability that the removal of that node would prevent one such cascade. The thickness of the lines just represent the participation rate in the cascades. So two things follow from this example. The first is that if you look at the figure, you'll see that there is no obvious difference from the network perspective in terms of trophic level, degrees, and so on, between the nodes that trigger cascades and the ones that prevent cascades. So it's not clear that you can learn about this type of control of dynamics by only inspecting the structure of the network, as we could expect, of course. The other thing is, if you look at the species that are saved, we have considered all the individual cases, we see that in roughly 1/3 of the case, you have very easy to understand interactions. So in this case here, S is the species that's saved by the removal of F. And it is so because they share a common prey. So it does make sense that removing F will increase the availability of the prey, which may help the survival of S. But more often than not, these interactions, they are long range. Okay? In this case here, you have that the removal of F increases the population of I, that increases the population of J, that in turn increases the population of S. Okay? So these are, in fact, generic properties. We tend to find this in not all, but most systems that we have studied in different domains. All right, so everything that I will show you this for is based on heuristic, system-specific methods. We don't have, up to this point, we didn't have a general method to identify this compensatory perturbation. Now I will present a general method. Just to create some language for what I will discuss next, let's consider again a food web in which you have a large number of species, but you are allowed to only mess up with 2 of them, S1 and S2. If you don't do anything, let's assume that this system would go to a bad state, but you have the opportunity to intervene at time t, and at time t, this system is right here. So I'm taking the plane that's parallel to the coordinate plane S1, S2, that passed through this point. I'm projecting the past trajectory. And let's assume that my target state is an attractor, a fixed point attractor that projected on this plane is right here. Now, if this is a problem in which I can only suppress populations, I can only move to the right and move down, then one might be tempted to think that it's impossible to bring this system to the attractor. In fact, it's impossible to bring it to the attractor directly, but it might be possible to bring it indirectly, as long as the basing of attraction of that attractor is intersecting this plane on this side, as it is the example here. So what's the basing of attraction? It's the set of all pre-images of the neighborhood of the attractor. So by definition, if you put yourself in the basing of attraction, you'll be driven to the attractor. So all you have to do is to perturb this system into the basing of attraction, and then it will spontaneously go to the state that you wanted. Sounds simple, but the problem is that in high-dimensional systems, as the networks that we care about, there is no analytical, neither numerical method to identify basins of attraction. It is relatively straightforward to identify attractors, but not basins of attraction. So we should be able to do this. We have to be able to do this without knowing where the bases of attraction are. So this is the general formulation of this problem. I will assume that we have a system that is described by ordinary differential equations. That's not essential. What is essential is that the system has dynamical variables, x, and has parameters that I'm identifying here by beta. So we assume that there is an attractor that we know and that we would like to reach, A. And the basing of attraction of that attractor is omega beta. Okay? So then the problem is this one. We happen to be outside the basing of attraction of A. So we'll never get there spontaneously. We'll go to a different state. And we would like to look to find a perturbation of this state that would bring us to the basing of attraction of that attractor A. So put as such, this is a trivial problem. It's a trivial problem because I can just move directly to the attractor. But the problem is that in general we have constraints, like the ones I've been telling you about. Inequality constraints. Genes are, say, easier to suppress than to overexpress. And the quality constraints, say, those involved in this cell maintenance we cannot mess with. Now, when you have these constraints, now this problem becomes very challenging, okay? If you don't manage to control your system using this, you have another alternative, that's to play with the parameters of this system, the parameters beta. So in this case, too, you have constraints. You have, say, in the case of species, we would be talking, say, about the mortality rate. Some species you can only suppress, only reduce mortality rate. Others you cannot mess with because they are, say, protected species. So in the first case, we are trying to go to the attractor. Here we are trying to bring the attractor to your current state. So you are trying to change the attractor in such a way that you will find yourself inside the basing of attraction. Okay? Once you are inside the basing of attraction, you will be attracted to the attractor. And once you are close enough to the attractor, you can relax this change of parameter and go back to the original parameter. Okay? So that's the idea. So how do you solve a problem like that without knowing where the basing of attraction is? Let's try to think about this in terms of the simplest case so I can actually draw a figure, the case in which the equality and inequality constraints are given by these inequalities here. and this equality. So in this case, the image is not sufficiently good for you to see the gray area here. It looks so much better on my laptop. The rectangle that is formed between this dot here and the coordinate axis is where you can move. And then you have an attractor that you'd like to reach here, given that your current state is this one. So if you don't do anything, this is the orbit that will bring you elsewhere. There is some intersection between the Bayesian of attraction of that attractor and this region of admissible perturbation. Therefore, there is a solution. But we don't know, because we don't know the attractor. I'm just drawing the attractor to facilitate your life, even though you can see it anyway because the projector is not helping. So the problem then is the following one. We have to find a way to get inside this region here without knowing where it is. So we will use is a form of forecast-based strategy in which we evolve the trajectory, we find the closest approach point to the attractor. The attractor is something we know. Then we see what direction we should move to get closer to the attractor. And we then come back here and see what should be the original change here so that we would have that change over there. Okay? So that's the idea. You do this in small steps for the same reason that when we integrate a differential equation using Runge-Kutta, we use small steps so that you can use the fact that things are locally straight lines. At the end, just to make this work in practice, you end up using we formulate this using as a nonlinear programming problem. So we run an optimization to choose the directions here and here and keep them small all the way through. So we set conditions like we want the size of these steps to be not too small but not too large, and we want them always to go forward, not backwards, things like that. So we have applied this to many systems. And we have not been able to find a situation which doesn't work. There might be cases in which it would not work, but we have not yet come across such case. So I will give you a few examples, but in case you are not paying attention, this is a chance to get the entire picture. I'm recapitulating the entire thing here. So you have a network which happens to be in a state that will converge to a bad state. Okay? That's the evolution here, bad state. So this is the network representation. This is the phase space representation of the same system. And you want to find a perturbation that under certain constraints would bring you to the Bayesian of attraction of a good state. So once you do that, the system evolves spontaneously to the good state. Okay? So if you are allowed to perturb only 3 nodes here, the yellow ones, that would be, in the one-dimensional, that would be to say that you can move within this cube here, depending on how your constraints look like. And maybe this is your Bayesian of attraction. There is an intersection. Your goal is really to get inside that intersection, okay, without knowing where it is. So here is how this iterative algorithm works. You make small steps. You don't know where the Bayesian of attraction is. This time I'm really not drawing it. And you keep doing those, making those small steps up to a point where all of a sudden you approach the attractor. So that's when you cross the Bayesian of attraction. Okay? I'm not sure I will have time for a movie. Yeah, I won't. So let me just say a few final words then. Just to test that this really works, we built systems like this one in which we start with nodes that have 3 stable states, and we couple them very weakly so that we could use then the structural stability of this system to infer that solutions exist. So the algorithm should find them. And indeed, it found the solution every time. And what is more important, it finds the solution, we can show this analytically, in a time that goes with n to the power 2.5, okay? Where n is the number of nodes or the number of dynamical variables in the system, to be more rigorous. So this is excellent. I can run a network with, say, 1,000 nodes, a 1,000-dimensional system in a laptop as cheap as this one. Okay? There are some things that are obvious, like if you are allowed to perturb more nodes, the success rate will increase. There is some correlation between the centrality of the nodes and their participation in success control sets. In particular, if you take a network that is random, there will be a positive correlation between success rate and degree. Okay? Things that are less obvious. You might be tempted to think that if you have noise or uncertainty in your model, that this would fail since I'm using a deterministic formulation. It will fail, and that's represented by the red here, if you stop your algorithm as soon as you cross the Bayesian boundary. Okay? But if you instead do what you're supposed to do, that's you get as close to the attractor as possible within the given constraints, and that's is a trivial X-ray step, because you can use the gradient descent, for example, to do that. After you have, the difficult thing is to cross the Bayesian boundary. Once you are inside the Bayesian boundary, everything is easy then. So once you do that, you don't have the problem of sensitivity to noise. You can go to relatively high noise, and this system, it is in gray here, so you can see, and the success rate will remain high even if the size of the network increases. Okay, I'm showing just two sizes here, but it remains high even for larger networks. Same is true for parameter uncertainty. So the deterministic component of the system is enough for you to make reasonable predictions about the control problem, even when you have noise and parameters that are not completely determined. This is the last slide that I want to discuss in detail. We have, what we have here is an associative memory network, which was studied in detail by Nishikawa and Hoppenstedt. In this network, each node is a phase oscillator. This network has, all the attractors in the network are fixed point attractors. And in this fixed point attractor, those nodes can be at either phase 0 or phase pi. So you can think that they are either on or off. So you can use them to store patterns. And what we did here was to train the network to store the letters of the word network. So then we ask the question, suppose that you are in the attractor representing the letter N, and you want to go to the attractor that represents the letter E. Can you do that by only perturbing the pixels that are off? And go from E to T and so on using the same strategy. So here's what you get once you do that. When you go from N to E, this is the state that you reach, and then spontaneously goes to E. It still looks more like N. The color code here is the phase relative to a reference. And then from E to T and so on. Okay, so this is spontaneous. This is spontaneous. The perturbation is the vertical one. So what I want you to see here is two things. The first is that this is an example of reprogramming, which is an important thing in cell biology, even though I'm using this example. So we didn't have anything going wrong in the network, as in the previous examples. We just wanted to change from one state to another. And this type of control approach can be useful for that. But the second thing is more important. I want you to notice these gray parts here. Those are errors. So this is an error. These are other errors here. So it means that I tried to go to E, but I actually reached a different attractor, which is a parasite attractor. So even though I tried to store only those 7 patterns in this network, the network has a lot of parasite attractors. So I failed to go to my target. That might be because there was no way to get to the target, or maybe because I didn't run my program properly. But regardless, I reached an attractor that is similar to that one. So this tells you that you would be able to read the word network here even with those errors, right? So this means that even when I fail to reach my target, this approach will tend to bring me to a better stable state. Okay? We have been using this to study applications to the identification of therapeutic interventions. The most successful case that we have considered is the case of blood cancer. It is a network that represents it. I will not discuss in detail, but I will just say that this example, for example, is a case in which sometimes to go to the normal cell state, you have to move towards the disease state, which is counterintuitive. But if you think in terms of state space and all possible shapes that attractors can take, basins of attractions can have, this does make sense. We have also been using this to study the control of power grid networks, and which is another example I won't be able to discuss in detail, and the impact of invasive species in ecosystems. So the conclusion then is the following. Network response to perturbations can, to a large extent, be controlled by eligible compensatory perturbations. This type of perturbation can be identified without knowing anything about the basin of attraction, other than the attractor itself that's known to be inside the basin of attraction. So these interventions can be effective even when the target state is not directly accessible, and I've shown you examples of that. And one thing to keep in mind, that's often the case that the globally advantageous perturbation that this algorithm comes up with are either apparently locally deleterious or even in fact locally deleterious, okay? And that's a fact of life. Sometimes you have to get rid of some parts of the network to save the rest, okay? And here are the names of the people that actually did the research. Good part of what I presented here is in this manuscript where the main author is Sean Cornelius, who's a graduate student here and will be an excellent postdoc candidate as soon as this research gets published. Thank you.